August 15, 1945. The war in the Pacific had ended, but for thousands of Japanese soldiers. The fighting had already been replaced by an entirely different kind of battle, the struggle to survive captivity. At a prisoner of war camp in the Philippines, men who had once fought with ferocity in the jungles and seas of the Pacific now stood behind barbed wire fences. Stripped of rank, stripped of weapons, stripped of the empire they had sworn their lives to defend. They were lean, hollow-eyed, and burdened by shame. The rising sun flag no longer flew above them. Yet what awaited them in this new life was not another punishment, not another lash of the whip or starvation rations. It was something far stranger, something so ordinary to their captors that it bordered on absurdity. On a blistering tropical afternoon, the guards wheeled in tubs filled with cold, creamy ice. The sound of metal scoops scraping against frozen walls echoed across the yard. Bowls were handed out. Inside, pale, melting lumps of vanilla ice cream. The Japanese prisoners froze in silence, staring at the bowls as though they were traps. Their minds recoiled at the sight. This could not be food. Not in captivity. Prisoners were not fed luxuries. Prisoners were punished, humiliated, and broken. Yet here, in the heat of the Philippine sun, they were being given something that tasted of sweetness, of normal life, of children on street corners in distant American towns. Men who had endured the thunder of artillery at Guadalcanal and the slow death of hunger in the jungles now sat bewildered before a mound of frozen milk and sugar. Some lifted spoons tentatively. Others hesitated, convinced that this was a cruel trick, some psychological weapon meant to mock their defeat. To understand their disbelief, one must step back into the mindset of the Imperial Japanese soldier. For years, propaganda had painted Americans as soft, decadent, and incapable of true sacrifice. Japanese troops were taught that surrender to such an enemy was the deepest shame. In their world, prisoners of war were expected to be treated harshly, even brutally, as they themselves had treated captives in Nanking, Bataan, and countless villages across Asia. The concept of an enemy feeding you something as frivolous, as luxurious, as ice cream, was incomprehensible. To them, this was not just food. It was a symbol, a paradox. In their eyes, the Americans were demonstrating both unfathomable abundance and a kind of mercy that cut deeper than cruelty. The camp itself bore the marks of war's end. Wooden barracks lined the perimeter, their roofs sagging beneath tropical rains. Guard towers stood watch, rifles slung casually as discipline loosened with peace. Inside, Japanese officers and enlisted men mingled with the quiet awkwardness of a shattered hierarchy. Some had once commanded hundreds. Now they clutched tin bowls and waited in line like children. The air smelled of sweat, rust, and wood smoke. Yet that day, another smell drifted into the camp, the faint, sugary aroma of vanilla carried on the humid breeze. Prisoners whispered among themselves, eyes darting toward the tubs as if they held a forbidden treasure. For the Americans, serving ice cream was not an act of indulgence, but a calculated statement. During the war, ice cream had been more than dessert. It was morale, medicine, and a symbol of industrial might. The U.S. military had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure their troops received it. Navy ships were equipped with ice cream-making machines. Floating ice cream barges were deployed to serve fleets at sea. To a nation built on abundance and mechanized supply chains, ice cream was as essential as ammunition. It was proof that American soldiers did not merely endure war. They lived it with comforts unthinkable to their enemies. Now, in the aftermath of surrender, that same abundance was being extended to former foes. The Japanese prisoners struggled to reconcile what they saw. They had heard of American factories, of the endless production lines in Detroit and Chicago, but the idea that even in captivity, Americans could casually dispense something as wasteful as frozen dessert was staggering. In their homeland, civilians had boiled bark for soup. Rice, once plentiful, had become scarce to the point of famine. Soldiers at the front had fought on meager rations of millet and dried fish. The contrast was crushing. Here, the enemy had enough food to give ice cream to captives. Ice cream, which melted away if not eaten quickly, a luxury that mocked scarcity itself. The first spoonfuls were met with silence. Lips touched the cold surface, teeth recoiled from the chill, and throats swallowed cautiously. Then eyes widened. The taste was alien, sweet, creamy, and impossibly cold in the tropical heat. Some prisoners broke into quiet laughter and involuntary sound, as if the absurdity of it all could no longer be contained. Others wept silently, spoons trembling in their hands. For men who had prepared to die for an emperor, who had accepted the possibility of starvation or execution. This simple act of eating ice cream became a moment of profound disorientation. The guards watched with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. To them, it was routine. Ice cream was served at bases, hospitals, and ships. It was part of the rhythm of American life. They could not fully comprehend the cultural shock unfolding before their eyes. What was ordinary to them was extraordinary to their prisoners. The Americans believed they were offering kindness, perhaps even a gesture of humanity, to men who had once been enemies. But to the Japanese, it was more than kindness. It was proof of everything they had been told could not be true. It was proof that America's wealth and industry were boundless, that even its enemies were enveloped in abundance. The scene unfolded like a parable of the war itself. One side, trained to embrace suffering, astonished to the point of disbelief by the comforts the other side took for granted. It was not the roar of engines or the flash of steel that revealed the gulf between the two nations, but the quiet clink of spoons against tin bowls. In that moment, ice cream became more powerful than bombs. It was the soft, melting edge of victory, the taste of a world where industry and logistics had defeated hunger and scarcity. And as the tropical sun dipped lower, the prisoners finished their bowls, the last drips of vanilla melting away into memory. They sat in silence, each lost in his thoughts. Some thought of home, of wives and children who might never taste such things again. Others thought of the emperor, of honor, of the strange fate that had led them from battlefield to captivity, from fire and blood to frozen sweetness. It was, for them, a moment that captured the full strangeness of defeat, to be fed not with scorn, but with ice cream. September 1945. The war was over, yet its echoes rumbled across every ocean, every ruined city, and every broken family. For the Allies, victory meant parades, medals, and a return to homes where factories still roared and supermarkets still brimmed with food. For Japan, defeat meant something far darker: starvation, humiliation, and the shattering of a warrior code that had promised glory in death but had delivered only ashes and surrender. To understand why ice cream in captivity struck such a chord with Japanese prisoners of war, one must step back into the larger theater of the Pacific and see the war as it truly was: a clash not only of armies, but of entire civilizations, of resources, of ideologies, of what it meant to fight and what it meant to live. By 1942, Japan's empire had stretched from the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Marshall Islands. Its banners flew high, its fleets roamed the seas with arrogance, and its armies believed themselves invincible. Yet behind the banners lay a harsh truth. Japan's industrial base was small, its supply lines stretched thin, and its agricultural reserves inadequate for prolonged total war. Rice shortages plagued civilians by 1943, while soldiers were forced to supplement rations with anything they could scavenge. Hunger became as much an enemy as the Marines storming ashore at Guadalcanal. The United States, by contrast, mobilized like no nation before it. Detroit's auto plants churned out tanks, planes, and trucks in endless streams. Midwestern dairies supplied powdered milk by the ton, canned foods rolled off assembly lines, and Liberty ships carried them across the Pacific at speeds the Japanese merchant fleet could never match. War for America was not only about rifles and planes. It was about supply, about a doctrine that saw logistics as the lifeblood of victory. To American generals, keeping men well-fed, clothed, and rested was not indulgence. It was strategy. It kept morale unbroken, efficiency high, and the machine of war running at full speed. This divergence in philosophy defined the experience of war for both sides. The Japanese soldier was trained to endure privation with stoic silence. Suffering was considered noble, hunger a test of spirit. Surrender was dishonorable, and to rely on comforts was weakness. The American soldier, by contrast, was taught that proper equipment, reliable food, and medical care were rites of service. Morale was considered a weapon in itself. To the Americans, Ice cream on a battleship was no more surprising than ammunition in the magazine. Both were tools that made a soldier stronger. It was in this clash of expectations that the prisoner of war camps emerged after surrender. Thousands of Japanese troops laid down arms in August 1945, their faces hollow with disbelief. For years, they had been told that Americans tortured prisoners, starved them, and denied them dignity. Yet the reality they encountered often stunned them. Rations, though simple, were adequate. Medical care was provided. And sometimes, luxuries appeared, as if conjured from another world. Ice cream, cigarettes, chocolate bars. These were not weapons, but they carried the weight of symbols. To men raised in a culture of scarcity, they were reminders of the colossal gulf that had separated the two nations all along. The historical backdrop deepens the shock. By the final year of the war, Japan had been strangled by the Allied blockade. Merchant ships were sunk faster than they could be built. Cities burned under waves of incendiary bombs. Civilians survived on half rations, with rice diluted by barley, millet, and even acorns. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, entire cities vanished in atomic fire. The empire that had once promised a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had collapsed into hunger and rubble. Soldiers knew this. They had seen the desperation in villages and the thinness of supplies at the front. When they entered captivity, they braced themselves for worse. Instead, they were offered bowls of cold sweetness. American POW policy, while not free of flaws, was shaped by a mix of pragmatism and ideology. The U.S. sought to demonstrate the contrast between democratic abundance and authoritarian cruelty. By treating prisoners with a measure of decency, they hoped to undercut the enemy's morale and showcase the superiority of their system. For the guards dishing out ice cream, it was an afterthought, a surplus, a way of keeping order in the camp. But for the prisoners, it was a cultural earthquake. The clash of perceptions went beyond food. Radios blared jazz across the camps. American guards smoked cigarettes casually, and newspapers were passed around that spoke openly of politics and sports. For Japanese prisoners, who had lived in a world of rigid hierarchy and censored propaganda, this openness was as shocking as the ice cream. They had expected to be treated as less than human. Instead, they were shown glimpses of a world where even enemies were granted unexpected dignity. Yet beneath the surface lay deeper wounds. Many prisoners carried the shame of capture like an iron weight. They thought of families back home, of the disgrace their surrender would bring. Ice cream could not erase that. It could not silence the memory of comrades who had chosen suicide rather than captivity. It could not erase the indoctrination drilled into them since youth. That surrender was a fate worse than death. But it did plant a seed of confusion. How could the enemy, painted as barbaric and soulless, offer kindness? How could the empire of indulgence and machinery triumph so decisively over the empire of sacrifice and spirit? The historical stage of 1945 was therefore one of contrasts. On one side, a nation broken, its soldiers bewildered, its civilians starving. On the other, a nation of abundance, rolling out ice cream trucks even in the shadow of battle. This contrast was not trivial. It was the essence of the war's outcome. The United States had not only outfought Japan, it had outsupplied it, outfed it, and outproduced it. The bowls of ice cream served in POW camps were more than dessert. They were the physical embodiment of a war decided by industry, by logistics, and by the power of a society that could wage war and still feed its enemies with luxuries. And so, in the camps scattered across the Pacific, history settled in bowls of melting sweetness. Men who had once sworn to fight to the death tasted something they had never imagined in defeat. It was the true shock of war's end, not the bomb, not the surrender ceremony, but the quiet, bewildering taste of an enemy's abundance. For the Japanese, it was not merely ice cream. It was proof that the war they had fought could never have been won. The heat shimmered above the corrugated tin roofs of the camp as noon descended, pressing on the prisoners like an invisible weight. Men crouched in the shade of barbed wire fences, their uniforms reduced to rags, their bodies to sinew and bone. And then, again, the sound. Metal scoops cutting into frozen walls. The scrape, the clink, the unmistakable rhythm of bowls being filled. The Japanese soldiers rose instinctively, forming a line as though pulled by an unseen command. What they were about to receive was not rice, not barley gruel, not the thin miso broth that had sustained them through campaigns in Burma or New Guinea. It was ice cream. The hidden advantage was not the dessert itself, but what it symbolized, an industrial miracle invisible to the battlefield. To the Americans, ice cream was more than food. It was morale made tangible. It was logistics given flavor. It was a message: we have so much, we can afford to share with our enemies. The Japanese prisoners, raised on tales of scarcity, could scarcely comprehend it. In their minds, food was survival. Ice cream, on the other hand, was excess, luxury, softness, and decadence. Yet here it was, ladled into bowls as casually as rice. The secret was not simply abundance, but technology. While Japanese supply officers scrambled to find millet and dried sweet potatoes for starving divisions, the Americans had harnessed refrigeration as a weapon of war. Naval ships carried ice cream machines. Army depots stored frozen supplies in mobile coolers. Even forward bases, barely secured, sometimes boasted freezers that hummed beside generators. To the Japanese, whose supply lines had been strangled by submarines and whose armies often marched on empty stomachs, this was nothing short of sorcery. The disbelief among the prisoners bordered on spiritual. How could the same enemy who rained firebombs on Tokyo now hand them bowls of cold sweetness? How could the soldiers of a nation they had been taught to despise, men supposedly weak and undisciplined, extend mercy in such an unexpected form? To many, it was unsettling, an enemy who showed both terrifying violence and casual kindness. For some, it was more disturbing than cruelty. Cruelty could be understood. Mercy could not. Reports from guards noted the silence that followed distribution. The prisoners would take the bowls, stare into them as if gazing into another world, and then eat slowly, spoon by spoon, savoring every taste as though trying to understand what it meant. To the guards, it was simply ice cream, something they had eaten since childhood, something their military had standardized to keep spirits high. To the prisoners, it was a revelation. In truth, the hidden advantage was cultural as much as technological. American military doctrine emphasized care for the individual soldier. Feed him, clothe him, and keep his morale high, and he will fight harder and longer with greater efficiency. The Japanese doctrine, by contrast, demanded sacrifice. A soldier's stomach was secondary to his spirit. Suffering was proof of loyalty. To be pampered was dishonorable. This difference defined the two armies, and in captivity, it was laid bare in the strangest way imaginable. Through dessert, the prisoners whispered among themselves, voices hushed. Some refused at first, convinced it must be poisoned. Others, trembling, tasted it, only to find sweetness flooding their mouths, sweetness they had not known since childhood. It was not poison. It was kindness. Or was it mockery? The line between the two blurred. For men who had starved on jungle trails, who had eaten bark stripped from trees, the softness of ice cream was almost unbearable. It was a reminder of everything they had lacked, everything they had lost. The Americans had not intended this. To them, the gesture was pragmatic. Well-fed prisoners were easier to manage. Morale, even among captives, reduced the risk of rebellion or despair. But to the Japanese, the gesture carried deeper weight. It was a window into the enemy's strength. If America could serve ice cream to its prisoners, what could it not do? If it could sustain such abundance in peace, how could Japan ever have hoped to match it in war? A former prisoner, years later, recalled his first taste. He described it not as joy, but as confusion. Confusion that hardened into respect, respect laced with bitterness. The Americans had beaten them with bombs, with ships, and with planes. But in captivity, they revealed a power even greater. The power to treat abundance as ordinary, the power to turn luxury into routine. It was not just military superiority, it was civilizational superiority. This, then, was the hidden advantage, not ice cream itself, but the machinery of modernity that made it possible. Refrigeration, logistics, and industrial-scale production. While Japanese soldiers clung to Bushido, the Americans wielded factories. Where one side exalted the nobility of suffering, the other turned comfort into a weapon. And in the end, it was not nobility but abundance that triumphed. That day in the camp, as the sun dipped behind the guard towers and shadows stretched across the barbed wire, the last bowls were emptied. The prisoners returned to their bunks, silent, contemplative, and shaken by what they had witnessed. For some, it was the first time they understood the war had always been unwinnable. For others, it was the moment they realized their captors were not demons, but men of a different world. Men whose strength lay not in cruelty, but in a civilization that could afford to make ice cream in the middle of war. The sound of scoops on metal faded, but the impression lingered. For the Japanese, the taste of that frozen sweetness would become a symbol not only of defeat, but also of revelation. The enemy's hidden advantage was not firepower, not strategy alone. It was the ability to turn even the smallest comfort into an instrument of victory. October 1944. Leyte Gulf. Waves of fire and steel clashed across the Philippine seas. The largest naval battle in history unfolding beneath storm-racked skies. Japanese battleships thundered, their massive guns spitting death across the horizon. American carrier planes swarmed, shrieking down in waves that blotted out the sun. Beneath the chaos, fuel lines ran, refrigeration units hummed, and supply ships pressed forward like veins pumping lifeblood into the American war machine. Ice cream, inconceivable in such a setting, still found its way aboard the decks of destroyers and carriers, carried in insulated tubs, served between sorties. To American sailors, it was a small mercy. To their Japanese enemies, it was unimaginable. The technical heart of this miracle lay in refrigeration technology. By 1943, the U.S. Navy had designed and deployed what sailors jokingly called ice cream barges, floating factories dedicated entirely to producing the dessert. The most famous, a converted concrete barge stationed in the Pacific, could churn out 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, 1,500 gallons every day. Equipped with massive freezers powered by diesel generators. These vessels ensured that even in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, tens of thousands of sailors could be served a taste of home on land. The U.S. Army had equipped field kitchens and depots with refrigeration units that could withstand tropical climates. Trucks fitted with coolers carried frozen supplies across coral roads and jungle tracks. Camps were wired with electric freezers that roared beside canvas tents. In contrast, Japanese units often marched barefoot, carrying sacks of rice that spoiled in the humidity or subsisting on dried fish and millet. Ice was a luxury reserved for high officers, and refrigeration was scarce outside of major cities. Consider the SCR 399, a mobile radio truck bristling with vacuum tubes and transmitters, often accompanied by refrigerated support vehicles carrying not only medicine and blood plasma, but also ice cream and milk for the wounded. This was the American war machine, not just firepower, but an entire infrastructure designed to sustain life, morale, and the fighting spirit. Every watt of electricity, every pound of diesel fuel, and every truckload of powdered milk reflected an industrial base the Axis could not rival. Factories in Chicago, Detroit, and New York churned out freezers alongside tanks. Companies like Taylor Freezer Corporation retooled assembly lines to produce compact ice cream machines for military use. By 1945, the U.S. military had invested more than $1 billion in refrigeration technology, an amount staggering for its time. Ice cream became more than dessert. It was a symbol of mechanized abundance, a demonstration of what total war mobilization could achieve. The Japanese had nothing like it. Their navy limped along with dwindling oil reserves, their convoys shredded by American submarines. Ships rationed fresh water, let alone refrigeration. Soldiers in the field often starved within weeks of deployment. The contrast was merciless. Where one side froze milk into sweetness, the other boiled grass into bitter stews. Where one side built floating ice cream factories, the other dismantled fishing boats to make suicide torpedoes. Numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. The U.S. produced over 135 billion pounds of dairy during the war, much of it powdered or condensed, enough to supply both the civilian population and millions of soldiers abroad. Japanese dairy production, by comparison, collapsed under bombing raids and agricultural shortages. American soldiers consumed, on average, 3,600 calories a day. Japanese soldiers often scraped by on 2,000 or less, their bodies wasting away in the tropics. Abundance was not indulgence, it was power. The very coldness of ice cream carried its own symbolism. To the Japanese, huddled in humid jungles or shivering in Siberian outposts, cold was often a reminder of misery. But to the Americans, refrigeration meant mastery of the environment. Machines could bend heat and ice to human will. Ice cream became a portable climate, a frozen oasis in the sweltering Pacific. Eating it was a ritual of control, a statement that no matter how far from home, the comforts of home would follow. It was, in many ways, a weapon of morale as potent as any rifle. Soldiers wrote in letters home not only of battles, but of the ice cream served aboard carriers or at field hospitals. Wounded Marines at Iwo Jima remembered the moment cold dessert touched their tongues as vividly as the sound of mortars. For men who had endured nights of terror, that frozen sweetness was proof they were not forgotten. Proof that a nation's industry stretched across oceans to sustain them. 4 Japanese prisoners in camps. Learning of these systems only deepened the shock. Some watched as mobile refrigeration trucks rumbled into compounds. Others heard guards describe the floating ice cream barges. The sheer scale of it was unthinkable. They had believed Japan's willpower could defeat America's decadence. But decadence had been transformed into discipline. Comfort had become a weapon. The story of ice cream in war might sound absurd. Machines and barges devoted to dessert while bombs fell and battles raged. But it is precisely this absurdity that reveals the deeper truth. Modern war was not won by courage alone, nor by steel alone, but by the quiet hum of generators, the hiss of refrigeration coils, and the endless capacity to produce. Ice cream was not a distraction. It was proof. Proof that America's industrial machine could extend even to the smallest corners of life. Proof that luxury could march alongside lethality. In the final tally. Tanks and planes may have shattered Japan's armies, but ice cream revealed why the empire had fallen. It showed that the enemy could fight a war while still living a life unimaginable to those raised on scarcity. It showed that the industrial heart of America could do what Japan's spirit could not: sustain millions indefinitely, with abundance as routine as breath. And so, in the shadow of battlefields, in the aftermath of surrender, the prisoners of war who tasted ice cream understood what perhaps no speech could have conveyed. They had not been defeated merely by weapons. They had been defeated by a civilization whose factories could produce both bombs and sweetness, whose power lay not only in destruction but in the endless ability to provide. September 19, 1944. The Lorraine countryside, soaked with morning mist, became the stage for one of the strangest spectacles of the war. At Ericourt, in eastern France, the German Wehrmacht hurled 39 Panther tanks into battle against American armor. The clash roared through the fog, steel beasts crawling across muddy fields, their engines snarling like predators. Yet what unfolded stunned German commanders. The enemy seemed to appear and vanish at will, firing with uncanny coordination, moving in patterns that suggested invisible strings guiding them. The Germans called it witchcraft. But it was not witchcraft, it was radios, logistics, and an army that, unlike theirs, treated morale and abundance as strategic weapons. That same doctrine that had filled American tanks with FM radios also filled their camps with food, chocolate, and yes, even ice cream. The Germans who fought in Lorraine, like the Japanese across the Pacific, could scarcely comprehend the casual luxuries their enemies enjoyed. For them, the battlefield was a place of attrition and scarcity. For the Americans, it was supported by an industrial web so vast that even while fighting the greatest war in human history, they could indulge in frozen desserts at the front. Ericourt became a test not just of firepower, but of systems. American tank crews, though facing Panthers with thicker armor and heavier guns, fought with an unseen advantage: communication. Orders crackled across radio nets. Units maneuvered like chess pieces on a vast board, and supply trucks kept fuel, ammunition, and food flowing into the fight. German crews, by contrast, often relied on hand signals and shouted commands muffled by the roar of engines. Coordination collapsed as fog and confusion deepened. Tanks were abandoned, destroyed, or left stranded when fuel ran dry. After-action reports from German officers betrayed their shock. The enemy fought like a single machine, one noted bitterly. They could not grasp how so many tanks, spread across hills and villages, responded instantly to shifting threats. Nor could they understand how American soldiers, after hours of combat, returned to camps where food awaited, hot meals were served, and even bowls of ice cream could be found melting in mess halls. To them, this was not war. This was indulgence masquerading as discipline. Yet it was precisely this system that crushed them. The battle statistics at Aracourt are stark. In 2 weeks, the U.S. 4th Armored Division destroyed or disabled 86 German tanks, while losing only 25 of its own. Fog, radios, and logistics combined to tip the scales. German crews wrote of tanks that seemed to vanish in mist, of enemies who always knew where to strike. For them, the defeat was bewildering. For the Americans, it was proof that their hidden advantages, technical, industrial, and cultural, were as decisive as any gun or shell. The same lessons echoed in the Pacific, though the battlefield looked different. At Okinawa, Marines advanced under artillery fire, their supplies flowing through a relentless chain of logistics. Ice cream trucks appeared behind the lines, churning cold sweetness for men who had survived days of horror. Prisoners captured in the caves and ridges of Okinawa watched in disbelief. They had fought to the last on handfuls of rice. Their captors fought with full stomachs, cigarettes between their teeth, and ice cream waiting behind the lines. The contrast cut deeper than steel. German reports from the Western Front and Japanese accounts from Pacific camps converge on a single theme: confusion and shock at the enemy's ability to live well in war. For Germans, the shock came in the form of radios and coordination. For Japanese, it came in bowls of frozen sweetness. Both were, in truth, two faces of the same advantage, an industrial system so powerful it made abundance part of the strategy at Aracourt. German tank crews who bailed out into fields of mud were taken prisoner and led past American supply trucks rumbling with crates of rations. Some would later sit in camps where the same abundance that had defeated them was ladled into bowls as ice cream. In the Philippines, Japanese soldiers captured after years of jungle starvation stared at the same bowls, their disbelief no less raw. The battlefield and the prison yard were connected by a single thread: America's ability to make abundance ordinary. One prisoner later recalled. We could not understand how a people who ate ice cream in war had beaten us. But perhaps that was why we lost. The statement, though simple, captures the essence of Aracourt as much as the POW camps. Battles were not won by tanks alone, nor by courage alone. They were won by radios humming in fog, by supply lines unbroken, and by the steady hum of generators powering freezers behind the lines. The Germans left Aracourt broken, their panzers smoking wrecks in the mist. The Japanese left their camps broken, their pride melted like the bowls of ice cream they had consumed with trembling hands. Both understood, too late, that the war had been fought on a scale beyond their imagining. Their enemies had built a machine that fought not only with weapons, but with abundance itself. And so the lesson of Aracourt, like the lesson of ice cream in captivity, was not just about battlefields. It was about the quiet, unseen forces that shape war: technology, logistics, and the ability to make comfort a weapon. In the end, it was not just firepower that crushed the Axis. It was the strange, bewildering reality that their enemies could fight a total war while still scooping ice cream into bowls. Defeat comes in many forms. For some, it is the thunder of artillery or the collapse of a defensive line. For others, it is silence, the sudden recognition that the world they believed unshakable has already crumbled. For the German Wehrmacht in Europe and the Imperial Japanese Army in the Pacific, defeat was not only measured in lost battles, but in a creeping psychological realization: their enemies could fight a war with luxuries they themselves could not even imagine. Radios that stitched units together across fog and fire. Supply chains that delivered not just bullets, but ice cream. It was not simply a material imbalance. It was a spiritual one. Inside the prisoner of war camps, the psychological impact of ice cream was immediate and profound. At first, suspicion colored every spoonful. Men muttered that it might be poisoned, that perhaps it was a cruel experiment. But as days passed and no harm came, suspicion gave way to bewilderment. How could their enemy waste resources on sweetness? How could they pour milk, sugar, and powder into machines that produced frozen cream for captives? For men who had been trained to endure starvation as a badge of honor, the act felt surreal. Some accepted it with shame, others with gratitude, but all with disbelief. This disbelief burrowed deep. It was not simply about food. It was about the realization that their entire doctrine had been built on falsehoods. They had been told the Americans were weak, soft, and incapable of enduring hardship. Yet here was the paradox. The Americans did not need to endure hardship in the same way. Their strength lay in ensuring their soldiers rarely faced hunger, rarely lacked equipment, and rarely fought without the steady heartbeat of supply lines. Abundance had been transformed into resilience, and that resilience broke the spirit of men raised on the worship of scarcity. German accounts mirror this psychological fracture. On the Western Front, tank crews who saw their formations shattered at Ericourt, or infantry who heard American radios coordinating strikes with impossible precision, wrote of despair. How could discipline, courage, and sacrifice withstand an enemy who seemed to fight with invisible hands guiding them? The despair in their words is echoed in the silence of Japanese prisoners staring into bowls of ice cream. The tools differed, radios in Europe, frozen sweetness in the Pacific, but the message was the same. The enemy's strength was not just in weapons, but in the world that created those weapons. The impact went beyond individuals. Entire strategies began to collapse under the weight of psychological shock. Japanese units still holding out in jungles received reports from surrendered comrades, whispered through the bars of POW camps, that the Americans fed their prisoners well, even luxuriously. The knowledge ate away at resolve. Why starve in caves? Why die in hopeless charges, when the enemy treated even captives better than one's own army treated its soldiers? German morale, too, faltered as reports spread of American tanks that communicated flawlessly while theirs stumbled blind in fog. Defeat was not only military. It was mental, and what of the Americans? For them, abundance bred confidence. The very act of handing ice cream to prisoners reinforced their sense of superiority. It was a display of power cloaked in kindness. They knew their supply chains could bear the weight. They knew their factories back home hummed with such efficiency that luxuries could be extended to enemies without strain. This quiet assurance seeped into every soldier, every guard. To them, the war was already won, not just because of battles, but because of the world that allowed them to fight with comfort and coordination. The psychological toll on the Japanese was unique. For their cultural code magnified the humiliation. To surrender was dishonorable. To be cared for by the enemy was humiliation. To be cared for well, to be treated to luxuries like ice cream, was almost unbearable. It was as if the Americans had reached inside their very identity and revealed its fragility. Their emperor had promised a sacred destiny. Their officers had preached the glory of sacrifice. Yet here, in captivity, they discovered a truth too plain to deny. The enemy's system was not weak. It was overwhelming. Survivors would later speak of the strange duality of the experience. Some remembered the sweetness of ice cream with fondness, even gratitude. Others recalled it with bitterness, a taste forever linked to the memory of defeat. The bowls of frozen cream became symbols of everything they had lost: the empire, the honor, and the illusion of superiority. In the silence of the camps, as guards passed out rations and prisoners sat in contemplation, the psychological shift was palpable. Men who had once believed themselves invincible now faced a future where their enemy's kindness cut deeper than cruelty ever could. The Americans, knowingly or not, had wielded ice cream as a psychological weapon. It broke no bones, but it dismantled illusions. It left no scars, but it carved into pride. It was the quietest of victories, the softest of blows, and yet perhaps one of the most enduring. For in those camps, long after the guns fell silent, the memory lingered. The enemy who bombed their cities and burned their fleets was also the enemy who served them ice cream. And that contradiction haunted them more than fire ever could. August 1945 ended the Pacific War, but it did not end the questions that haunted the men who had lived through it. For Japanese prisoners of war, the taste of ice cream in captivity became a memory they carried back to their homeland, a story told in whispers to families who scarcely believed it. For them, it was not simply dessert, it was a revelation. It was the moment they understood that the war had been lost long before the atomic bombs fell, long before the surrender ceremony on the decks of the USS Missouri. It had been lost in the factories of America, in the endless convoys of Liberty ships, in the humming of refrigeration units, and in the ability of a nation to turn luxuries into tools of war. The legacy of that realization rippled far beyond the camps. In the immediate aftermath, Japan faced devastation. Cities lay in ruins, agriculture was crippled, and millions starved. Yet alongside hardship came transformation. Under American occupation, Japanese citizens saw firsthand the abundance of the very enemy that had defeated them. Ice cream parlors reopened under Allied supervision. Children tasted the same sweetness their fathers had been bewildered by in camps. A new generation came to see America not only as a conqueror but also as a provider. And with it grew an appetite for modernity, for technology, and for the comforts once dismissed as weakness. For the Americans, the lesson of ice cream and radios, of abundance and morale, became embedded in doctrine. The Cold War would test it again and again. In Korea, field kitchens churned out hot meals in mountains blasted by artillery. In Vietnam, supply helicopters delivered not only ammunition but also Coca-Cola, cigarettes, and canned fruit. In the Gulf War, fast food franchises appeared in bases across the desert, ensuring soldiers could taste home even while fighting half a world away. Modern network-centric warfare, with satellites, instant communication, and seamless logistics, was born from the same philosophy that had once placed ice cream machines on barges in the Pacific. Morale and abundance are weapons as real as steel and fire. The Japanese military, once devoted to sacrifice and spirit, absorbed this lesson too. Post-war, their rebuilt self-defense forces emphasized supply, technology, and coordination. The Bushido ideal of noble suffering gave way to a pragmatic embrace of systems that sustained rather than drained the soldier. It was not shameful to feed men well, to equip them with comforts, and to ensure morale. It was essential. The memory of defeat, sweetened and soured by bowls of ice cream, reshaped a military culture for generations. The global stage bore witness as well. Military historians wrote of the astonishing logistics of the U.S. war effort, marveling not only at the tanks and planes but also at the small luxuries that kept men fighting. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, at Nuremberg, confessed with a weary bitterness, "We built better tanks. But you built tanks that worked together." Others added silently, "You built soldiers who fought together, fed together, and even indulged together." America's lesson was clear. Connection outweighed firepower, and abundance outweighed sacrifice. And yet, the human side of the story endures strongest. In memoirs, prisoners recalled the moment of silence as ice cream was handed out, the way spoons trembled in thin hands, and the way sweetness brought both laughter and tears. Some remembered it as humiliation, the taste of defeat melting on their tongues. Others remembered it as mercy, a sign that their captors were not the monsters propaganda had described. But all remembered it. Ice cream had seared itself into memory not because it was food, but because it was a symbol of victory, of abundance, of a world beyond suffering. The enduring power of that moment lies in its paradox. Ice cream is fragile, melting in the sun, disappearing within minutes. Yet in the camps, it became eternal, a lesson carved into the minds of those who tasted it. It was proof that in modern war, the smallest comforts could hold the greatest meaning. Where bombs shattered buildings, ice cream shattered illusions. Where fire destroyed cities, sweetness revealed the gulf between nations. It was not the weapon Japan had feared, but it was the one that revealed the war's true outcome that the decades past. The story lived on in documentaries, memoirs, and the quiet conversations of veterans. In Japan, it symbolized the turning of an age, from empire to surrender, from scarcity to abundance, from death to survival. In America, it became part of the mythology of victory, proof that the nation's power lay not only in its armies but also in its ability to project comfort across oceans. And in military academies across the world, it became a case study in logistics, morale, and the truth that war is fought as much with supply chains as with rifles. The lesson echoes today in every modern conflict. Armies still carry the spirit of those bowls of ice cream. Whether in the rations packed for soldiers in Afghanistan, the cafeterias of forward bases in Iraq, or the satellite-linked morale systems of fleets at sea. The legacy is not desert, it is doctrine. It is the recognition that men do not fight in isolation. They fight as part of a system, a network, a web of support that stretches from battlefield to homeland. When that web is strong, victory follows. When it breaks, defeat is inevitable. And so the story closes where it began, in a prisoner of war camp, in the heat of the Philippine sun, where men stared in disbelief at bowls of melting vanilla. They had faced death without fear, endured hunger without complaint, and marched beneath banners that promised destiny. Yet in defeat, it was ice cream, not bullets, not bombs, that revealed the truth. A truth that still resonates. In modern war, the side that can turn luxury into routine will always triumph. Sweetness, absurd as it seemed, was the final proof of power.